The lyrics say, I've been reading books of old, the legends and the myths, Achilles and his gold, Hercules and his gifts. Every time I read that line, I want to go, Hercules, Hercules. You know, y'all thought it too. Spider-Man's control and Batman with his fist. And clearly, I don't see myself upon that list. Like, there are just times in life where you begin to realize that if the world's definition of a superhero is what you have to live up to, that you're not going to be able to make the list. There's just times when you go, you know what, I don't even know how to be the dad that I have been called to be. I don't even know how to be the spouse that I've called to be. If it's got to be fairy tale bliss to be the husband I need to be, I just don't know that I can live up to that. If I've got to have superhuman traits and abilities and rip open my shirt, and ain't nobody want to see that, I just realized, you know what, I'm not on that list. And what I think is so special about today's story of Boaz and the story that we come along in the book of Ruth is that it really is a story that points out to us that being a hero is not what our world really defines it as. It's not superhuman ability. And really what God needs is not another superhero, because there's already one. He has one. His name was Jesus. He was the superhero who came with all of supernatural gifts that he needed. But what he needs is someone just like this guy. Like just like you. He needs someone just like you to be able to be the person that he has created you to be. And I was reading last night, actually, in this book, The Land of Stories, which is the book that my daughter and I are reading together now. Isabel's 11 years old. She loves to read, and we'll alternate, Connie and I will, reading to her at night, and then she reads all kinds of books during the week as well. But we're reading this story, this book, The Land of Stories, and the premise is that these young twins, these children, fall into this book, and when falling into this book, they fall into a fairy tale land. And they're living out all of the stories, Rapunzel's tower, and they're living out they go in the Red Riding Hood's forest, and they find Jack and the Beanstalk along the way. But at this point in the book, they're in the charming kingdom. And when they're in the charming kingdom, they come to this place where they meet this guy who is driving this horse and carriage, and his name is Smithers. And when they meet Smithers, they go up to him, and Alex is a little girl in the story. She asks him a question. She says, hey, do you ever find it overwhelming, she says to this man living in the charming kingdom. Alex asked Smithers, does it ever get frightening living here and knowing that at any moment a fairy could fly by and grant you a wish, or an ogre could run up and eat you? Smithers looked at her curiously. Does such a place exist where people can't unexpectedly be helped or be hurt? You know, a lot of times we go through life thinking that we don't live in the land of fairy tales, and thinking, I guess, that we can't be the type of hero that these fairy tales produce. But I believe what the story of Boaz teaches us is that we're all living in a place where real hurt can come and can be upon us in just a moment. We're all living in a place where we need real help sometimes, where there's real need and real help in our lives, and we need it. And I think that we begin to believe we can't be the man that God has called us to be, or the woman that God has called us to be, because we just believe we can't measure up. And part of the reason that we believe we can't measure up is because we don't believe in ourselves. Like, we don't even believe we can do it. Why would anyone else believe that we can? And we don't believe in ourselves because we don't realize how much God believes in us. Look at Ephesians 2:10. It says, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. You see, you may look at yourself and see all you're not. How many of you have done that? You've been guilty of just seeing all that you're not, and all that you don't measure up to be, and all that you can't do. But God looks at you and sees all that you are. In fact, He wants something just like you. And let me put it another way. This is so encouraging and so hope-filled. He made something just like you. Look at Psalm 139. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and I am wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. I love this sentence, the last sentence especially, because he says, I am your works, and you've made wonderful things. And here's what I know about your works. I know that your works are wonderful, which in turn means that I am wonderful. See, that's identity of who I belong to. I know who I belong to. That is awareness of who made me. Not only do I belong to him, but he made me the way that I am. That is confidence of who I am. And when I begin to have confidence in who I am, I will begin to believe in myself because God believes in me, and he made me, and he thinks I'm his handiwork. He thinks I'm his masterpiece. And in fact, look, as it continues on in 1 Corinthians 1:26 and 28, it tells us, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many of you were influential. Not many of you were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He says, you weren't really a hero. You weren't really anything superhuman. You weren't really all that. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are. You see, faith in Christ makes extraordinary heroes out of ordinary people. It's sort of amazing when you think about it how God can use us. He can use us with our ordinary failings. He can use us in the ordinary parts of our lives. He can use the ordinary gift sets that we have. He can use the ordinary mistakes that we've all made. And he can do an extraordinary thing through us and make heroes out of us. And that's what happens to Boaz. In fact, let's look at the Bible story in the book of Ruth as we continue on. We left Naomi and Ruth, remember last week, they had arrived home to Bethlehem, and now they're there, but they need to live. And so we pick up in the story in Ruth 2 with verse 2. It says, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. And so Naomi says to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Can I just teach you something real quick? Nothing just turns out. Nothing just happens. It says, as it turned out. It didn't just turn out. God was orchestrating Naomi and Ruth's life. God was orchestrating Boaz's life. And now all of a sudden, he is converging them together. Nothing just happens. God sees to it that it happens in a way that he can use. Look at Ecclesiastes 3:1. Everything that happens in the world happens at the time that God chooses. You didn't just happen here. It wasn't just because your dad invited you and said, hey, will you join me? Or your son invited you and said, hey, will you join me? You didn't just show up to church here because this is your church and this is where you come, but God knew you were going to be here. He knew you were going to be a part of Freedom Church. Can I say this? I think there's someone here who God knew was going to come here for the first time, or the first time in a long time, and was going to hear a pastor who was honest with you and got up and said, you know what, I've been anxious today, and I don't know why. And you were going to be able to resonate with that and go, wait a minute, I can listen to this guy because he too has been through some stuff. See, it didn't just happen. Just didn't just happen to happen. It didn't just turn out. Somebody say, turned out for what? If you know what that is, we have crosses and you can repent afterwards. Let me tell you something else about this story. Ruth is, it's important for us to know what Ruth is up to here. Because if we don't know, we won't truly be able to understand the part that Boaz plays, and we won't truly be able to understand where Ruth was in her life, and perhaps you will miss an opportunity to find yourself in the midst of the story as well. Ruth is going to the assistance line. Maybe you've been there before. You've been to a place where you've had to go to a friend and say, I can't make the rent this month. Will you help me out? And maybe you've been there before where you had to go to your small group and say, guys, I've been in a hard place lately and I don't know what to do about it and I need some help. Maybe for others of us in here, you've been at the place where Ruth was, which is in a line at a nonprofit organization, or maybe coming to your church, or perhaps in a government assistance line. Because for you to be able to make it and to be able to raise your children and to be able to make it and to be able to just get your feet above water, you're going to have to get somebody's help. Does anyone live in a world where they don't need help or maybe hurt at some time? And it's important for us to realize this about Ruth because we can kind of begin to understand how she felt. I can understand it to some level. My family, my mom was a single mom, and we grew up, we were poor. I didn't know we were poor, but we were very poor. I know now what my mom made during that time, and we were very poor. Barely even a living wage that my mom made as a single mom during those days. And as a result, we found ourselves with government assistance, and it was called a farmer's home. Maybe some of you have been in or heard of a farmer's home. We lived in a farmer's home. And what the farmer's home was is when the government had the good idea to not put government assistance all in one place and kind of in these, facilities, but they decided to let people kind of have some ownership and own a home. And so we were able to get assistance and a stipend that basically went towards the mortgage, a piece of it, and then we would cover the other piece of it. But the thing about a farmer's home, and I understand why they did this, because it was expedient and it was the best way to do it in a way that you could build them for cheap. But all the farmer's home looked exactly the same. And so there would be in a neighborhood a few farmer's homes spread out through the neighborhood, but everybody knew. They knew that you were in a farmer's home. And everybody knew what a farmer's home was, and they knew that if you were in a farmer's home, there was a reason you were in a farmer's home, because that's because you were poor. And so I knew my friends kind of knew that we were in that, and as I grew up, I knew that we were been in that situation before. Maybe you've been there too. I can tell you another situation where we really learned what it was like to be where Ruth is when we first started doing foster care. We were told by our caseworker, she said, this baby that you're going to get is already on the WIC program, and I know that foster care gives a little stipend towards stuff, but it doesn't really cover everything. And if you will keep them on WIC, you would be able to get formula for him, and you'd be able to get that formula. How many of you know has had little babies? That's basically like saying, there's a rainbow and there's gold at the end of it, because formula is liquid gold, basically. And so we were like, okay. So Connie went, and she had this humbling experience of going to stand in the WIC line and go through the WIC process. And can I just tell you that I know that we can always do things better, but we can do that process better as a country. It's very humiliating. It's very, it makes you feel inadequate. And so she went through that process, and she left realizing why many people leave that process not feeling like anybody believes in them. It's not a confidence building situation. But then the real place where she felt it as she went to the grocery store. The same grocery store that she's always gone to, the same grocery store that she's literally gone to hundreds of times and spent, may I tell you, I know thousands and thousands of dollars with 4 or 5 kids that we always have. And but she went in this time, she had the WIC coupon, and she said, I now know what it feels like to be stared at. For people to look at you and think, well, why did you have all those children? For people to look at you and think, why don't you get a job? And she said, I knew, because I felt inadequate. I felt humbled. I knew that everyone was treating me differently. The way the lady spoke to me was different than she normally spoke to me. The attitude that she had, the way that they treated me as they were even bagging the groceries was different than the way they had treated me before. And this is where Ruth was. Ruth was in a place, in a foreign land, without any means to take care of herself, and she was literally standing in the EBT line. This was the government assistance of the day. In fact, it's in Leviticus. Leviticus tells us this. It says in the scripture, if you'll put it up for me, it says, when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. Leave it for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. So Moses had literally given a law from the Lord of how to take care of poor people and foreigners, that you don't pick the grain on the edges of the field, so leave just a little bit of margin. It's a little bit of margin so you can be generous. There's a principle in there. Just leave just a little bit of margin so you can always have the ability to be generous. And then he said, there's some things that you're going to drop as you're harvesting. Don't have anybody come behind them and pick that up. I know you could do that, and that would get everything, but just leave that and let the poor people and the foreigners pick from this side and let them pick up the leftovers. And so that was the rule, and that's where Ruth finds herself. She finds herself in the assistance line in this place in her life. And then Boaz comes on the scene. It says, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, he says. The Lord bless you, they answered. Now, this shows us something about the character of this hero named Boaz that I think we can learn from. See, this is not just a standard greeting. It sounds like that he's just saying, well, how are you doing? And they're saying back, we're doing great. The Lord be with you? Oh, the Lord is with us, they said. But this wasn't just a standard greeting. In fact, I was studying this passage, and I was reading from some first century rabbinical writings. That would have been the Jewish rabbis of the first century that were writing about this encounter between Boaz and his staff. And what was really going on here, they said even the way that the actual original language would be written was that this was actually a question. That Boaz walks up and he says, is the Lord with us? In other words, what he was asking his harvesters is, are we obeying the Lord's commandments? Are we obeying the law? Even more specifically, what he was saying is, hey guys, are we being generous? Are we being generous? Are we allowing them to pick on the sides and the margins, or are we allowing the poor to pick up afterwards? And we see a principle here that I think we can learn from Boaz. This is something that heroes do, and that is what we expect, we must inspect. If you as a leader, whether that's a leader in your home as a dad and a husband, a leader in your work, if you expect something, you have to inspect it. In other words, if you want to grow as a man, you've got to inspect your heart. So you got to say, you know what, I want to grow, so I'm going to ask God, show me, teach me about myself. If you want your children to grow to love the Lord, one of the things you have to do is inspect what they're doing. You got to inspect, are they coming to church? You got to inspect, are they listening? You got to inspect, are they in a group, a small group? Are they growing? You got to inspect their hearts. Do they have the heart of God? And if you expect them to love God, you've got to inspect your process that you've got to get to that result. If you expect to have a great marriage, you've got to inspect, how are you doing at cultivating that marriage? Are you obeying the laws that God has put into place, that you are to love your wife as Jesus loved the church? Are you respecting your husband as the leader that God has given to your family and to your home? You got to inspect if you expect for something to happen. And that is most likely why Boaz noticed Ruth was in the assistance line, is because he was looking to see if anybody was in the assistance line. He was making sure. He wasn't just asking. They said it would have been a question, hey, are we being generous? And then what they said back to him was, the Lord is going to bless you. In other words, yes, God will rain down blessings on you because we are indeed being generous. And so he showed up for a kind of inspection, a surprise inspection. And the first thing he notices is who's there, and he notices that Ruth is there. But then look at this in verse 5. Boaz asked the overseer of the harvesters, Who does that young woman belong to? I thought about that phrase. If you asked that in Berkeley County, I don't know that you would get away with it. You would say, who owns you, is what he said. Who owns you? And I believe in Berkeley County, there would be a woman going, I don't know who owns me, but I'm fixing to own you. Fixing to own everything about you. But he is not. I was like, is this a chauvinistic statement? You know, just something of the times, because you may not know, but in Bible times, in that culture, women were not treated with any dignity. They were not treated they had no rights. They had no dignity. They were treated as property at best. At best. You'll see in this a little bit. They actually weren't even the most valuable property. But there was a chauvinistic, for sure, attitude. And I thought, is this just the chauvinistic attitude of the times? Is it just a sign of the times? And then I was thinking about that. I was like, no, I don't think so. And I read some people who would agree with me that said, no. What Boaz was really asking was, who's supposed to be taking care of her? Like, why is this young woman here getting assistance? I'm glad we can give her the assistance, but who is the husband? Because he didn't know that her husband and father-in-law had died, and her husband's brother had died as well. He said, who is the husband? Who are the brothers that should be taking care of her? Who's the brother-in-law that should have taken her on? He's asking, who should be taking care? Who's the deadbeat? Who's the deadbeat here? And what it shows us about Boaz really is another character trait that I think we can learn and how we can be heroes, is that he cares. He cares. Do you know that you will never regret being kind? Like you will never leave a situation and go, man, I was too kind. I was just too nice to them. I shouldn't have been so nice. I shouldn't have been so kind. I shouldn't have helped them that way. I shouldn't have been there for them that way. I've left lots of situations thinking, man, I was a jerk. Have you ever done that? I've left lots of situations going, oh wow, I could have done something back there, and I totally didn't do it. The other day, it was in my own world. You ever get there? You're in your own world. I was just walking, and I had all the kids with me, and I was just walking, and I got into the door, and I wasn't even really looking, and I got through the door, and I held it for my kids, and I got them through, and then I just let it shut, and I hear behind me someone go, well, thank you very much. I appreciate you holding that door for me. And I was like, I'm so, and then she wouldn't even let me. She was mean. I wasn't gonna mess with her, but she wouldn't even let me open it. Then she was like, I got it. She walked on through. I was like, man. But I really thought, man, I just like slammed the door in some very mean woman's face. Then I thought, maybe that was good. She needed a humbling moment. But I regretted it. But you never regret being kind. Like, you never regret being caring. And I can tell you about my daughter. She's 11, and she's going into 6th grade now. And so she just started youth group, Freedom Youth. Wednesday night, you see all the Freedom Youth are here because they slept in this morning. And she started. First off, when in the world did I get to a place in life where I can have a 6th grader? That was the first thing. Second off, can you imagine how nervous Alex Posticek, who's sitting right here on the front row, he's our youth coordinator, is having the pastor's kid for the first time show up to youth group? I've been making it better, though, because all week I've just been like, got you. But I was he couldn't have been as nervous as I was. Oh, my goodness, I was so nervous. I felt like I was going to youth group for the first time, and I took her, and it was parents were supposed to be there, so I wasn't just loitering. Parents were supposed to be there, and so I took them and took her in, and I asked her before we went, I said, Izzy, how do you want this to go down? Do you want me to stick with you? You want me to hang with you? What do you want to happen? She's like, yeah, just hang out with me. So we get in there, and let me tell you what happened. She wasn't nervous at all. As soon as we get in there, she's like, I'm fine, I'm whatever. She's not trying to get rid of me, though. I'm still hanging with her. And then all of a sudden, let me tell you about Deanna and Kristen. Deanna made a beeline, just a beeline for Isabel, because she's the 6th grade small group leader and on our dream team with Freedom Youth. And so she came over, she got Isabel, and before I knew it, Isabel's gone. Like, she's with Deanna. And Deanna took her over, and she introduced her to some other sixth graders and to some other leaders, and I could tell she was telling her what was going on and what was happening, and Isabel's feeling all comfortable and all. Dad's not, but Isabel's feeling all comfortable. They needed a liaison for dads that day to come over, give us some chamomile tea, give us some stuff on it, just kind of relax us down a little bit. They had that, but they made her feel great. Then afterwards, we went to the porch party is what it was called. It's just for the youth to hang out because it's summer, and so some extended time for youth group. And we were in the line at the cafe, and we were getting ready to buy some drinks and stuff. And so we're in this line. And when we're there, Kristen comes over. And Kristen is an 8th grader who loves writing, reading, and Jesus. And I have a 6th grader who loves writing, reading, and Jesus. And so Kristen came over, and she was like, Izzy, and she's in 8th grade now. She came over and said, Izzy, do you want to come sit at our table? Now, do you remember being in 6th grade and what it was like for an 8th grader to even talk to you, much less an 8th grader to invite you to sit at the 8th grade table? Isabel was like, she really wasn't. I would have been, but she really wasn't. But she walked over, she sat at the 8th grade table. I can't tell you what an impact that made on me, that they were kind and caring to my daughter. I can't tell you. And here's what I was thinking. I was like, what made it so kind? What made them so kind? And I thought about it. They noticed her. They noticed her. As soon as she walked in, Deanna was like, beeline, there's Izzy. And can I tell you, it wasn't just because she was the pastor's kid, because I saw her 5 minutes later doing it to another little girl that was a little anxious when she came in, was kind of looking back like she didn't know what to do. And beeline, she went right to her. She noticed her. Boaz noticed Ruth. She was an unnoticeable. She was in the assistance line. But he noticed her. It's the kindest thing that you can do for someone. You want to be a hero? Notice somebody. Look them in the eyes and ask them and mean it, how was your day? And then actually wait for an answer instead of, hey, how was your day? Oh, yeah, I didn't really want to hear that. I just wanted you to say fine so that we could do that, right? That's what you really want. No, how was your day? And then stare at them uncomfortably in their eyes until they answer. No, don't do that. That's not kind. Just being kind. What would it be like if we just notice people that they're sitting alone, that they're by themselves? What if we just notice? What if we were a church that kind of got the feeling that someone was alone at church, and we went over and said, hey, why don't you come sit with us? What if we were the kind of church and people that knew that a smile is a powerful tool in the hand of God? Have you ever just needed a smile? When you just walked into somewhere and you just needed for somebody not to mean mug you for just a minute, right? I mean, you just needed somebody not to have the excuse that they've got RBF, that they've got that, You just needed them not to have that for just a moment and just be like, can you just smile at me? He just needed somebody to look at you with kindness and care. You'll never regret. He noticed her. He cared for her. That's what he did. And then the overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab. The Bible wanted to be plainly obvious there. She's a Moabite who came from Moab with Naomi. I thought that was funny, and Alex did too. That's because he's trying to impress me because my little girl's in 6th grade. I'm sure. And she said, let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. So she came and said, can I do what Leviticus says I can do? She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. Do you realize what he did? Now, you got to understand, Ruth is not going to come out of the assistance line. She didn't come over to him. He came over to her. And she would have been down, picking up the grain. And I was actually reading, the way she would have sat would have been in a way that no one would have been able to see any of her flesh. So she would have sat very low to the ground, and she would have been picking out up all of the little pieces of barley that she could. And so Boaz would have had to come over, had to notice her, but then he had to come over and he had to get down at her level and he had to look at her in her eyes. When do you think the last time a foreigner, a poor foreign woman, had any man look into her eyes that didn't want something else from her besides just her to know he noticed her? Can you imagine what she felt in that moment when he said, hey, you stay here. You glean right here in my field. And I've told these men, by the way, not to hurt you, because how many times can you imagine that had happened? Foreigner, woman with no rights, and the men take advantage of her. And I was thinking about this. There was another story in the Bible where Jesus came, and they had thrown this woman into the road, and they were getting ready to stone her, and he came and he noticed her. There was another time when a woman came in to Jesus and said that she wanted to wash his feet, and she was weeping on his feet and washing his feet. And the other men around the table were complaining about her being there, and Jesus said to them, didn't you even see her? They were talking about her like she wasn't in the room. And he said, didn't you even see her? Can I tell you something? In the midst of whatever you're going through right now, God is eye to eye with you right now, and he notices you. He notices what you've been through. He notices what you're going to have to go through. He notices how hurt you feel. He knows that on Father's Day, this one's tough for you. He knows. He's looking at you. Boaz notices her. But then he shows us another characteristic as well. Because this story, next week you're going to see that God is going to take this encounter between Boaz and Ruth, and it's going to literally change the world. Now, everybody says literally now, and it bothers me because it doesn't mean literally. Does that make you mad too? When people are like, I literally think my head is going to explode, it hurts so bad. You're like, I want to stay for this, because if it literally explodes, that is going to be awesome, and I'm going to YouTube it. That's what's going to happen here. No, you figuratively mean, but it literally changes the world, this encounter. It is Esther 4:14 being lived out. Perhaps this is the moment for which you were created. He is in the moment for which he was created. Boaz is. He's there. And just because he noticed her, because he cared for her. Why? Because he was there to make sure that he was obeying the law. He was inspecting what he expected. And so we see the characteristics of what it takes to be the kind of man Boaz was that makes a hero. But let me ask you this. But how do we do it? How do we do it? How can we be something just like this? I mean, we see Boaz, but he made it to the Bible. Like, how do we get to be an ordinary guy who just kind of happened upon his field and met Ruth and fell in love with her, and it unfolds into a relationship that changes the world? How do we do that? Look at the lyrics from the song. It says, but she said, where'd you want to go? How much you want to risk? I'm not looking for somebody with some superhuman gifts, some superhero, some fairy tale bliss, just something I can turn to, somebody I can kiss. I imagine that Ruth, when Boaz comes over to her, is just thinking, hey, I just need somebody to help me. I just need somebody to take care of me. I don't need a superhero. I don't need a fairy tale bliss. I'm not looking for any of that. I just need some food. I just need some food. I need something to take back to Naomi because I told her I would take care of her. I just need some help because I'm in the line where help is to be given. And as I look at the story of Boaz, this hero, right? I mean, when we talk about Boaz, if you've been around the Bible very much, you know about Boaz and you've heard his name a little bit, and you know he's one of the heroes. Like, he's a hero in the Bible. And we read this and we see, men, that this is so encouraging because he has a standard that he has set that, listen to me, is attainable. Like, it's very attainable what Boaz does. He does two things that we can do as men, as husbands, as dads, as co-workers. He does two things that change the world. One, he is available. Guys, you got to be available. You want to be a hero to your children. You want to be a hero to your wife. Be available. Study them. Be available. Be available when they're in a time where they need you. Be available and not on your phone. Be available and not still at work. Be available. It is a simple act, but it is a hero's act to be available. He was available. He was obedient. Because he was available to his crew, he was now available to Ruth. And because he's available to Ruth, he was available to God to play a part in the story that will change the world. But he had to be obedient for any of that to happen. And he wanted to make sure that he was obeying God. We see that in his character. He comes out to inspect what he expects. But also, I love what we see about him. His obedience transferred into something else, which was he wanted to love people the way that God loved people. See, he didn't want to love people by going out there and going, well, why don't we put these ladies to work? They could be on the front end of this line, and they can be picking, and I'll pay them just a little bit. He wanted to love people the way that God loved them, that in the midst of their hurt and in the midst of their pain, he was still willing to love them. He wasn't there going, hey, why don't you get a job? Hey, why are you here? What'd you do to get here? Surely you caused this for yourself. He just wanted to make sure that he could love people the way that God loved them. And as I see that, I go, okay, that's it. That's the sermon. Be available, be obedient. Be available, be obedient. What can God do when you are available and obedient? Two simple acts that make a hero, but that was not the norm. In fact, look what it says in verse 8. Remember, he said to her, don't go and glean in another field and don't go away from here. In other words, what he's saying to Ruth is, this is not the norm. So don't go to another field because it's not going to be that way. In fact, I read about this in the commentaries. It said, though this was the Levitical law, it was not obeyed. Like there were very few farmers that obeyed this law and harvesters that obeyed this law. The fact of the matter was, it was another one of the laws that the Jewish people were disobeying. But Boaz was obeying it. So he says, don't go to the field because this is not very common. He also tells her, listen to this. He says, hey, by the way, I told the men not to hurt you. Why does he say that? Because he knows that she knows she had no rights and they would lay hands on her and they would hurt her. But he wanted her to know, not here. Not here. It's the norm that you would be abused if you leave here. But don't leave here because I will take care of you. And this is all setting up another character trait of Boaz I think is so important. So in this story, Boaz takes interest in Ruth. I think it was in that moment that God joined their souls together as he looked into her eyes and she looked into his eyes and they had a connection. You'll see this connection, and especially next week we'll talk more and more about that. But he realizes in the midst of this that there is someone else who already owns the rights to her. And you say, wait a minute, what do you mean the rights to her? Well, what would happen is someone would own the rights to the land that her husband owned in Bethlehem. And because they owned the rights to that land when he died, she didn't inherit the land. His next of kin would inherit the land. And he knew there's someone here who is the closest of kin to her. And by owning the rights to the land, he also owns the rights to Ruth. The land was more important because the land would stay in the family time after time. The person just came along with the land. That's how the rest of the world felt about Ruth. But Boaz didn't feel that way. See, he wasn't interested in Ruth's land. He's interested in her. He notices her. He doesn't know she has land. He just knows she's in the line, and he notices her. He's interested in her. So let me show you a piece of the story, this last piece that is so often missed. Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer, that would be the man who had the rights. He was called the guardian redeemer because he was the guardian of that land and the redeemer of that family by taking it on. He had mentioned earlier came along. And Boaz said, come over here, my friend, and sit down. So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here, and they did so. He gets a little crowd. And then he said to the guardian redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I know that everybody's kin to Elimelech. Just deal with it. In the Old Testament, they were kin to everybody. They married each other. It's weird. All right, so that's everybody's kin to Elimelech. So he's kin to Elimelech. She's kin to Elimelech. We all kin to Elimelech. All right, so our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you redeem it, do so. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you. And I, Boaz, I am next in line. So he says, hey, if you want to redeem this land, redeem it. If you don't, don't. And the guy says, I'll redeem it. Why not? I'll take the land. So he says, I'll redeem it. Then Boaz said, I think Boaz had this plan. So then he says, on the day that you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow. He's just painting a pretty picture here, isn't he? She's Ruth, she's a Moabite, she's a foreigner, she's a dead man's widow. She comes with baggage. That's what he was saying. He said, you go acquire Ruth in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. He says, I can't do it. So he skipped down to verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons. Did you hear that? The one reason not to quit is better to you than 7 sons. The one reason to hang on is going to turn out for the best, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David, who would have sons, who would have sons, who would one day have a son, who would have sons, and a son named Jesus. Do you see the story? He just happened to be in the field. He was kind because he was available. He was obedient because he loved people the way that God loved people. And in the midst of that, God was able to take something ordinary and do something extraordinary with it. Here's the principle. When you are willing to do what others won't, God will use you to accomplish what others can't. There was somebody else who was unwilling. They were unwilling. I know there's some dads here today who you are now parenting children who somebody else was unwilling to parent. They call you stepdads. And now not all dads all dads who have stepdads in a situation have abandoned their children, and I know that. And there's some stepdads who have great relationships with the biological dads. But I know that there's some of you here, you're a stepdad because you stepped into a role that somebody else wouldn't do. Can I tell you, as someone who's been raised by a dad, I don't even call him my stepdad, he's my dad. And I'm so glad that when I was 9 years old, he stepped up and said, I will do what someone else won't do, and because of that, God can accomplish great things through me. There's some of you, there are some of you who you've been willing to marry someone who needed somebody to take care of them. They were hurting, and you've been willing to walk a long walk with them, and you're seeing some fruit now in your life that's incredible. You've been willing to step up and take a risk that others weren't willing to take, to do some things that others weren't willing to do. See, when we're willing to be available, obedient, there's nothing that can stop us. Because God can use someone who's willing and available and obedient, and nothing can stop God. Tell you what, when I preach slow, I go a lot longer. Y'all better hope I get my energy back next week. But I hope that God has found you in a place where you're willing to be available and to be obedient. What could we do if we were available and obedient? What could happen? I bet it would be more than we could ever ask or imagine. God, thank you so much for the fact that you want to change us. God, you want to take us through some things. God, you love us. You care for us like no father ever could, because you are a good father. And so today, God, I pray that we would be inspired to be obedient, that we would be inspired to be available, and that, God, you would work through us in Jesus' name.